For Creamer Media's Polity, I'm Dimakatso Motau. Author and political activist Professor Raymond Suttner is in the studio to talk to us about the ANC's focus on mass movement during the 1950s. Raymond, welcome.
Thank you.
The 1950s are often seen as a special period in the history of the ANC. Do you agree with that? And if so, why?
I think it's a special period in the first place because the Nationalist Party came to power in 1948 and they started to implement massive repression. First, the banning of the Communist Party, group areas, started to build Bantustans with the Bantu Authorities Act, extend the past laws, a lot of forced removals and a lot of repression generally. Now, on the side of the ANC, the Youth League had managed to elect a new executive to the ANC, which would implement their program. Dr. Kluma, who had actually agreed with the formation of the Youth League, when told that they would only support him for his re-election as president if he supported their program, said that's blackmail, and he was not prepared to do it. And they replaced him with Moroka, Dr. Moroka from the Free State. Now, Moroka and Sisulu wrote letters to the Prime Minister informing them in 1952 that if they didn't repeal certain laws by a certain date, they would embark on defiance of these unjust laws. And that was a very significant campaign. During that campaign, a lot of people went to jail. The ANC membership rocketed from 7,000 to 100,000 paid-up members. That means people who didn't just sign, they paid, so they were fully fledged members. For the ANC, it was a very important step in that it no longer said, we disagree, but we owe allegiance to this government, because by breaking the laws, you are really saying, I am not bound by laws that deny me my humanity. Now, the government was very repressive in their reaction, and eventually the campaign was stopped. Now, it's very interesting when you study the 1950s, when they embark upon a campaign, when you stop it is very important, because otherwise it peters out and people become demoralized. What was also significant in the 1950s began with the declaring of the Communist Party to be illegal. Now, some of the ANC leadership interpreted this as signaling what would eventually happen to the ANC. And consequently, they developed the M Plan, named after Mandela. And the M Plan was actually a preparation for going underground. People organized themselves in groups, small groups, cells or units. And this was partially successful, especially in the Eastern Cape. But it later became important when the ANC was declared illegal. But what is important about the development of the 1950s, they went on the offensive with this defiance campaign, but they also decided after that campaign to advance an alternative vision of the South Africa they wanted to see. And that is in the Congress of the People campaign that led to the creation of the Freedom Charter. When they first decided on that campaign in 1953, people started to gather demands from all over the country. That is to ask ordinary people, what do you want to see in a future South Africa? And they wrote these demands sometimes on cigarette boxes, on pages torn from school exercise books. Sometimes the Freedom Volunteers, as they were known, would write down the demands. These all went to a central place. Some people say this was written by one person, but what had to be done in reality is you had to consolidate these demands. And if one person said something, it couldn't be in the charter, but they had to take the consensus. That became the charter. At the Congress of the People, it was adopted. And then the state reacted viciously. They made the charter the basis for the treason trial, where 156 people were arrested, trial that lasted till 1961.
How do you evaluate the ANC campaigns of the 1950s?
I think the campaigns turned the ANC into a mass organization. Previously, the organization used to meet at conferences once or twice a year, and it was not really an organization, although we've seen in the previous interview that Dr. Kluma and Reverend Canon Alata had been starting to build an organization. Also, during the period when Walter Sisulu was Secretary General of the ANC, they, for the first time, started collective leadership. Instead of the president deciding and a few people deciding, it was a decision of the leadership as a whole. But the 1950s also saw the broadening of the base of the liberation movement, or the ANC-led liberation movement, to include women's organizations, organizations of all population groups, whites in the Congress of Democrats, coloreds in the Colored People's Congress, Indians in the Indian Congresses, and SACTU was formed, South African Congress of Trade Unions. So it was a movement forward towards the vision of a South Africa that would be not whites only and not black, not Africans only, but all people.
Were there campaigns outside the urban areas, and what about women's campaigns?
Well, to start with women's campaigns, a lot of what happened in this period affected women very directly. Women didn't carry passes, although there were repeated attempts. One of the earliest campaigns of the ANC, or outside the ANC, was in 1913 when women marched in Bloemfontein saying, "We have done with pleading, we now demand." So women had been resisting passes for a long time. But in the 1950s, they made a lot of attempts to implement it against them, and they resisted, especially fiercely in some areas like Zeerust, where there's an interesting alliance between the chiefs and the women. One of the chiefs, the Chief Moilwa in Dinokana village, was asked by the native commissioner, as he was called at the time, to tell his wife to carry a pass. And he said, "Who the hell is verwoord? He is just a man," and he refused to do it. So you had resistance by women. One of the most famous ones, or the most famous one, being the March on the Union Buildings, where women came from all over the country, and they wanted to give their petition and dump their passes, dump their objections on the Prime Minister for Stratham, and Stratham was not there. And the leaders of the delegation, when they came out, looked on these 20,000 women, raised their fists into the air, and they sang a song that had just been composed for there, which means, "You have struck the women, you have struck a rock." So that's women, and more on the rural areas. They were trying to extend what they called the Bantu Authorities Act, devolving powers to the reserves with a view to Africans realizing their political rights there, not claiming rights in the central government. So that was resisted in a number of different ways by the ANC and other organizations in that period. After Sharpeville, there was a massive crackdown. Any person who tried to do anything significant against the apartheid regime found themselves banned. So that for the ANC to decide to go underground was very difficult, but it was necessary because the space for legal activities had been narrowed down so greatly.